Okay, welcome. This is for the Globalization unit that goes along with weeks 8 and 9 for DCPS distance learning. Okay, welcome. This video is going to help us kind of go along with those materials that are going to help with the last unit. Congratulations, we made it to the end of World History 2. The inquiry question for this Globalization unit is this question right here. Is globalization a good thing? Now we need to know what globalization is, and during the unit you're going to be doing a lot of reading and thinking about some of the good and some of the bad that go along with globalization. So the performance task, as you can see, I will talk about more at the end, but it's going to be an essay where you're going to argue whether globalization is overall good or bad, basically. We'll go over that more at the end. So this video is going to cover the end of the Cold War. It's just some background on it. What is globalization? I'm going to show you a little video about kind of the economic shifts. It's a good video. I didn't create it. And then a review of the performance tasks. So let's go ahead and get into it. A little bit of Cold War background, because many of your teachers covered the Cold War, but maybe didn't talk about the end and what happened. So first off, let's talk about the Soviet Union going into Afghanistan. As you can see here, the Soviet Union is huge. And Afghanistan is this country right here in yellow. And you can tell that it's close by. So why would the Soviet Union want to influence its regional neighbors? Oh, for exactly the same reason that it wants to just, expand its way of life. And they think that because it borders on Afghanistan, that the Soviet Union should have influence over it. The same way that the United States thought, hey, we could fight for the things we believe in by influencing Afghanistan. And so at first, both sides were doing a lot of trying to buy influence in Afghanistan, just trying to trade, and it was more or less like a positive competition until the Soviet Union decided to send in 100,000 troops. And from 79 to 89, these Soviet soldiers took control of major cities in an attempt to support this more Soviet-friendly government. Now, the Soviet Union dealt with the rebels because obviously there were some in Afghanistan that did not like the fact that the Soviet Union came in with troops. And so the Soviet Union would destroy entire villages and were just ruthless in fighting against these rebels. Foreign support, specifically from the United States, but also China, Pakistan, was supporting the rebels to try to stymie or frustrate the Soviet Union's influence in Afghanistan. And so they had this conflict in Afghanistan that lasted a long time. So in this brutal 9-year conflict, it's like 1 million civilians were killed, as well as 90,000 Mujahideen fighters, 18,000 Afghan troops, and approximately 14,500 Soviet soldiers. And so this conflict took a lot out of both sides, but the Soviet Union eventually withdrew from Afghanistan. And so that kind of leads us to what we can see as the end of the Cold War. And so in March of 85, this guy over here to the right, Mikhail Gorbachev, wound up becoming leader of the Soviet Union. And at the time, the Soviet economy was not doing very well. It was in direct competition with the United States. And you couldn't really change anything because it was still based on a command economy, which, as we studied, is when the leadership is telling industry how much to make of each thing. There's no capitalism involved. And so there were two major changes. One of these was known as glasnost, or political openness, which kind of went against the communist way. So glasnost eliminated parts of the Stalinist tradition of banning books, secret police, political prisoners were released, the newspapers now had freedom of press and could print some criticisms of the government, and other people could actually run for office. So this was very counter to the way things were run. Another major reform or change that Gorbachev set in was perestroika, or economic restructuring, basically putting in parts of capitalism like competition and private ownership, and it loosened the Soviet Union's grip on business, right? He believed that private initiative would lead to innovation and changes in technology. So basically more capitalism. And so these were two big changes. He was trying to get rid of the old command economy because it couldn't keep up with the United States at the time. And they were still in this rivalry with the United States. And eventually, so these changes take place, but eventually the Soviet Union just could not keep up economically, even with these new reforms. And so the people of the Soviet Union were frustrated with the bad economy, and they were frustrated that these changes made them more like the United States and weren't willing to see if the changes were going to lead to long-term benefits. And instead, there was these big independence movements on the part of the republics in the Soviet Union fringes. And so one by one, all these Baltic states, as you can see here on the map, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, they all declared independence from the Soviet Union and wanted to be their own country again because they didn't like the direction that the Soviet Union was headed. And so there was a lot of protests, and eventually Gorbachev was forced to resign as president on Christmas Day in 1991. And he gave up his office saying, basically, we're now living in a new world. An end has been put to the Cold War, to the arms race, as well as to the mad militarization of the country, which crippled our economy, public attitudes, and morals. And this, more or less, was the end of the Cold War, which meant that the influence of Russia and the Soviet Union was a lot less because it was broken up and fractured into all these little pieces. Okay, so that kind of tells us a little bit about the thing to keep in mind is at the end of the Cold War, now we're in sort of like a unipolar world. The United States is the preeminent economic force, but now we have, Russia is still influential, but now we have China as a major economic player. And so we start into this next part of history, which we're going to talk about, like the rise of globalization into the 90s, 2000s, all the way to present day. So what is globalization? Okay, globalization as an idea. It's basically the process of this rapid economic, cultural, and institutional integration among countries. Basically, we're all connected quicker, faster, and more deeply than ever before. And this happened because there's an increase in trade, more access to money, right, investment, and then improvements in technology. The internet has changed the way that we live, work, play, share culture, everything. And so this phenomenon known as globalization has occurred. Let's look at the graphic here on the right. This is just a good kind of example. When most of you have access to, you have a cell phone, right? I'm going to use the iPhone as an example. I'm an Android user, but you get the point. The iPhone, even though we think of Apple as maybe like an American company, and it may have been designed here in the United States, all the things that go into the iPhone are actually part of this like global chain. For instance, some of the minerals and materials may come and largely do come from different parts of Africa and are then sent to different places for processing, be it Australia or China. Once the phones are all manufactured here in China and then are sent to different locations for distribution. So you can see that there's like a global manufacturing process that brings you your iPhone. And that only happens, this is like a result of globalization. Whereas before globalization, things were largely made in one place and maybe shipped to and used locally, or then maybe shipped to one other place. But global supply chains have changed the way we live, work, and play. Okay, so there's types of globalization when we think about this. One type is like economic, which means that like if you have money in the United States, you could invest somewhere else. There's not a lot of barriers to invest in something globally. So there's more opportunity to invest in India or China or, Iceland, wherever, because countries are trading more. Another one is social. Because of the spread of the internet, information and ideas are spread at the speed of light. Right now, we're learning about COVID-19 and coronavirus updates by the minute because of the internet, basically. And so we learn about each other's cultures and share information at the speed of light, and that has good and bad effects. And political. Countries are more willing to cooperate with one another for purposes of trade, or at least willing to sit down at the negotiating table more so than they were before. And so all these are types of globalization: economic, social, political. Now, you're going to be reading a lot in this unit about some good and some bad parts of globalization. So some of the good are things like increased competition globally, better technology, right? Because there's more competition, there's more innovation. People want to make more products, they can sell them everywhere. There's more investments and more opportunities to work if you have mobility, or a lot of companies are creating jobs in other places, and things are actually cheaper to produce. Some of the jobs that may go overseas from like a US or a large multinational company, they'll find the cheapest place to be able to make something, which means that the product sells at a cheaper price. Now, some of the bad things that go along with that, globalism and globalization does lead to the exploitation of cheap labor without laws in place, right? Also, there's an increase of economic inequality. We may not be paying laborers in certain places very much money, but the head of these multinational corporations are actually making a lot of money in a different market because they're able to sell the Nike shoes that only cost, $3 to make. They can sell for $200. But that money doesn't go to the day laborers. That money goes to, the stockholders and heads of these companies. So the economic inequality is a bad thing, and also negative impacts on the environment. I'm just giving you a broad overview. You're going to be thinking about this question, like overall, is this good or bad throughout the whole unit? I'm going to show you a quick video now that's going to talk about the transformation in the economy.
All right, we're going back in the Wayback Machine. We're going back to 1950.
We never had a driver.
The typical American family in 1950 was in, you might say, a very optimistic mood.
And the new vacuum cleaner has
World War II put the economy back to work.
We were in an extraordinary position of having abundant manufacturing capabilities, great technology, an educated workforce, and the rest of the world needing to rebuild.
American family consume goods and services that were overwhelmingly produced in the United States.
The latest model.
Nice.
Is that something?
Let's have a picture right there, Jen.
You had cars that were made in America.
An alarm clock. Oh, for the guy who never can find a sharpened pencil. A radio. Oh, all right.
I'll tinker in the
You'll
basement.
tinker with it, yeah, in your shop. Jay,
The old card
no
shop.
yo-yos at the table.
Okay, now we're in 2014. What happens?
A very large proportion of what you see in your home is not produced in the United States.
Oh, look at this. This is from, this is from Switzerland.
Any automobile is made with parts that come from a number of nations around the world.
I don't know exactly what country these Rockports are being made in right now, but I know that we make almost no shoes in this country other than New Balance, and they don't fit me.
Most of the toys that you see around you would be produced in China, Vietnam, Malaysia.
There is a piece that comes from Mexico, another piece that comes from South Korea.
These Band-Aids are made in Jersey, Johnson & Johnson.
Take the iPhone or the iPad that have become sort of symbols of our modern technology. The iPhone, that's a American technology, but it's actually assembled in China.
So we've seen a little bit about how the economy has changed since the 1950s as a direct result of, the end of the Cold War, the rise of globalization. And so let's talk about what you're going to do in this unit at the end, the performance task. You're going to be answering this question: is globalization a good thing? And you're going to be doing it in a 5-paragraph essay. Now, there's going to be a chart that kind of looks like this. And as you go through either watching a video like the one you just saw, or by doing a reading about globalization, you're going to be asked, what is the effect of globalization in this case? And then, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And then you'll look at kind of as a whole, what do you think about the effects of globalization? So as you're doing each piece of the reading, constantly be thinking about, is this a more positive or more negative thing? Some readings may present both sides, but it's your job to kind of evaluate this and answer the inquiry question as best you can. Again, it's about, is globalization a good thing? Good luck.